The glory of their times, the story of the early days of baseball. What we're going to do today is review some of the great baseball players of the past, see what they look like, learn a little bit about what America was like in those days from the early 1900s through the 1940s. Most of what we're going to do is based on the concept of the book by Lawrence S. Ritter, The Story of the Early Days of Baseball, told by the men who played it. Many of the stories we're going to share are stories from Ritter's book and by Ritter's colleagues who captured all of this information. We're also going to feature the baseball photography of Charles Conlon. Now, Charles Conlon was born in Albany, New York in November 1868. He died in 1945. Married, no children or siblings. He started working for a local newspaper, the Troy Press, in the 1890s. He really didn't have a great interest in baseball, but he did have a great interest in photography. He was encouraged by some of the editors at the New York Evening Telegram to see if he could connect with the Spalding Baseball Guide, which has been issued from the early 1900s through the present day, and would do a yearly guide of all the baseball players in the major leagues as well as the minor leagues. And then it would feature pictures of some of the star players. And so they asked Conlon if he would take some of these pictures. Conlon agreed, and he used a camera, very heavy camera with thick glass and negatives, which made action shots back in those early 1900s very difficult. He'd bring the equipment right onto the field, his favorite position being 15 to 20 feet back of first or third base. So he had to dodge line drives, thrown bats, hard slides into the bag, and he was the first with the not so, you might say, instant replay. This is an iconic picture and one of his greatest, and it was taken by mistake, actually. Conlon was standing behind third base when Ty Cobb, who's featured here sliding into third base, took off. As he approached the bag, the dirt and the action actually propelled Conlon and his camera to the ground. And Conlon thought that he'd missed this photograph until he got into the studio and realized that, in fact, the picture had been taken, and it's sort of an iconic picture. If you look at Ty Cobb, you notice that grim, gritted teeth that he has. So this was one of the great pictures of baseball, a picture taken by Conlon. And then here's a picture of the camera that Conlon would use, a Graplex camera. I believe they're still making them today. It was the quintessential camera of the time and was used by photojournalists in the first half of the 20th century. Now, the ball player that you're seeing here holding it, Germany Schaefer, was one of the great characters of the early days of baseball. You can see the fella in the Boulder hat behind him smiling. And we're going to talk a little bit about Germany Schaefer later and tell some stories on Germany Schaefer. But this is the camera that a lot of these pictures were taken with way back in the day. Our subjects are going to be stories impossible but true, stories great and unusual. We'll talk a little bit about baseball trivia, a little bit about baseball goes to war, all players who served in the armed forces in both the First and Second World War, players who starred or played in 2 or more sports. A lot of great stories about baseball, umpires, managers, many of whom started out as players. And then, although there'll be some lighter side moments on the way, some of the ball players who really were stars of what you would call the lighter side of baseball. So let's start with impossible but true. And we'll start with Odell Hale, who was a Cleveland Indians third baseman. This is a picture Conlon took in 1935. By the way, these cards were issued in the early 1990s by the Sporting News, and what they did was they purchased the Conlon collection, and they used those pictures to create these cards. And they hired some of the best writers, including Lawrence Ritter, to actually do good research and tell the stories of these ball players on the back of the cards. So this is an example of one of the cards, and then we're going to feature these cards, and I'll show you the pictures and we'll talk a little bit about them. But here's what the back of the card looks like. So you can see his name is actually Arvell Odell Bad News Hale. Nicknamed Bad News for his ability at the plate. It says here 3 exceptional years from 1935 through 1936, where he had a .307 batting average. After that, his play declined and his fielding did not match his hitting. And in 1935, he got an unusual assist when a line drive hit him on the head and then was caught on the fly by the shortstop, who turned it into a triple play. As far as I know, the only triple play caused by a knock on the noggin. Now, if we look at this card and we talk a little bit more about our friend Odell Hale, sometimes you wonder about these stories and are they true or are they not true? Or are they embellished? And some of them, obviously, as we go through this, are. But in this particular case, you'll see here's a picture that Conlon took of 2 people. On the left is Moe Berg, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him in our stories about baseball goes to war. But on Moe Berg's left, or the right side of this card, is Jack Kieran, who was one of the great sports columnists and radio personalities of his day. On the card it says that Jack Kieran was described as poetic, cerebral, and the most intelligent sports writer of his day. He was based in New York from 1915. He moved to the Times in 1927. And he was author of the paper's first signed sports column called Sports of the Times. The colorful Kieran once said of Brooklyn manager Wilbert Robinson, he knew baseball as the spotted setter knows the secrets of quail hunting by instinct and experience. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about Wilbert Robinson, who himself was a character. Kieran was also an expert ornithologist and became a panelist on a very popular radio program of the time in 1938 called Information Please. But why do we talk about Jack Kieran? Because if you do your research and you look at Sports of the Times, and you'll see by John, or he was known as Jack Kieran, and this is from the New York Times, September 18th, 1935. I picked it up from ProQuest Historical Newspapers, New York Times, on the College of DuPage library database. And you'll see a Sports of the Times, Running the Bases, page 28. And so here is part of the Kieran's article on the day after the great triple play. And in the middle of the page, it's got ninth inning, Cleveland leading the Red Sox 5-1, harder pitching. The Red Sox opened fire on Mel, and the ping, ping, ping of the base hit brought about a situation where there were 2 runs in, the bases filled, none out, and Orel Hildebrand doing the flinging for the staggering Indians. Leader Joe Cronin was at bat. Joe crowned the ball for a line drive towards third. Bad News Hale threw up his hands, but the ball tore right through cracked him on the sconce and bounded still in the air into Knickerbocker's hands at shortstop. The runners were all well on their way. It was a cinch to ferry the ball, quote, around the horn for a triple play, thanks to the handiwork of Bad News Hal. And it is a pleasure to note that this quaint method of starting a triple play has had no ill effects on the Cleveland third baseman. From the way he has been hitting and fielding since the Fenway episode, it is evident that he is still hale and hearty.